Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of the Book 'em Nook Show. My name is Kyle Colley, and this is a special book club edition of the Author Talks podcast. This episode is brought to you by Book 'em, the book community's new and best way to host dynamic online book clubs. Download the app and start your book club today at www.bookemapp.com. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. My guest today is the scholarly Jonathan Eig. Jonathan is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the book club choice of January for us, King of Life. Jonathan is the author of 6 books and has written biographies about iconic figures ranging from Muhammad Ali, Lou Gehrig, and Al Capone. He is a journalist, a writer, a researcher, a speaker, and a New Yorker. Jonathan, welcome to the Author Talk podcast.
Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it. I still feel a little bit like a New Yorker and a little bit like Chicago, and I've been in Chicago for 30 years now.
Yeah, nice.
I'll take them both. They're both great cities.
Yeah, they really are. And to start, I would love because Martin Luther King Day just passed last Monday. I'm curious to hear, like, in 2025, what does this day mean to you personally, and kind of have how you've seen the day evolve through your life?
That's a great question. Personally, for me, the King holiday is one big reason why I decided to write this book, because the King holiday, in a way, has watered down his message and his image. It's turned him into this sort of two-dimensional character, the 30-foot monument in Washington, D.C., the postage stamp, the street names. And people forget that he was real, that he was human, that he had flaws, and that he was really radical, that he was really religious. So I wanted to write a book that would be a more intimate portrait. So the holiday is a reminder to me that we need to keep doing the work, not only to celebrate him, but to embrace his humanity and not let people get away with turning him into this cardboard cutout.
Yeah, and that's one thing I really appreciated about your book was the vulnerability that we saw in King. We saw just not ability to know who he fully was early, right? Because I think sometimes we look at King and we're like, wow, he did all these amazing things, but for him to even go to at 26, still trying to figure out where he wanted to be and how to do his life was very interesting. So a little bit into like society's and understanding of Martin Luther King Day. How is that legacy kind of shaped and in your thoughts there?
Well, yeah, first of all, you made a great point that he was 26 years old when he becomes the leader of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And there was no plan involved there. Nobody could plan for that. He wasn't even sure he wanted to be involved at first. So I think it's great to remember that he had uncertainty, that he wasn't even sure whether this was something he wanted to do. And once he found himself thrust in this, that he went all in and he really risked his life, gave his life for his belief, for his commitment to the cause. And I think that's what we should remember when we think about the holiday, not just that, he had a dream and the dream came true and our work here is done, far from it. By the end of his life, he was saying that he felt like the dream was turning into a nightmare, that so much of the work that he did is even being undermined to this day. Voting rights are under attack, Black history is under attack, DEI is under attack, affirmative action is under attack. So I think the King holiday should be a reminder that King's life was not simple. He didn't just decide to become the leader of this movement and everything went great. He struggled and he felt like at times that he failed, and he kept going. So we got to keep going too.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about King's earlier life was his father. I think he played such a pivotal role in just the way he brought him into religion and into being a leader. Can you talk a little bit about Martin Luther King Sr. and kind of what you learned from him and his influence on Martin Luther King and the family?
Yeah, one of the great pleasures of writing a biography is that you get to do mini biographies of several other important characters. And I loved Martin Luther King Sr., or Daddy King, as everybody called him. And he's born Mike King. He's born into sharecropping in Stockbridge, Georgia. His parents had been enslaved. So we're talking about just 2 generations from slavery. We end up with a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And that does not happen without Daddy King. He is a hero. We should be writing operas about Daddy King. We should be like building monuments to him too, and to his wife, Alberta Williams King, because Daddy King, decides at the age of 13 to walk off the farm. He's not going to fall into the same trap that his father fell into with sharecropping. He walks off the farm and heads to Atlanta with his only pair of shoes tied over his shoulder and remakes himself and teaches himself to read and write, talks his way into Morehouse, marries his way into this preacher's family at Ebenezer Baptist. And the next thing you know, like he's preparing this possibility for the world to have Martin Luther King Jr. And that's it's just an incredible, American success story. But coming one generation removed from slavery, it's unbelievable what he is able to accomplish.
Yeah, his story, I think for me, reading it, the going through and just seeing how pivotal his dad was, and just the way he spoke life into the family, and especially into Martin Luther King, it really created a better understanding of who he was in those early days. I think another part that was very important was Sweet Auburn Ave. I grew up in Atlanta, so I went to school at Morehouse too. Can you talk a little bit about that community and just growing up and seeing at least levels of Black affluency and actually thriving communities in that area of Atlanta?
Yeah, Sweet Auburn was called like the richest Black street in America. And Martin Luther King grew up seeing Black-owned businesses, Black-owned newspapers, Black-owned funeral homes, and churches all over the place. And his father preaching this message that we're not just here to worship God, we're here to fight for our rights. And that's part of the Black social gospel. So he is filled with all of that. He's also living in this little bit of a bubble. So he's kind of a prince, he's royalty in the neighborhood, and everybody knows who he is when they see him coming. That's the preacher's son. And he's got a level of protection also because this economically thriving Black community, they're not quite they're not hit as hard when it comes to segregation. So King often felt a little guilty that he grew up in this middle class environment and that he was not subject to some of the really horrific racism and violence that other people of his generation were subjected to. And I think that gave him the imagination that he could speak out and fight back. He didn't fear the reprisals quite as immediately as some other people might have. Felt like, the sky was the limit, really. And you see that early on. He sneaks into kindergarten a year early. He skips all these grades. He goes to Morehouse at 15, right? So you can sense that ambition is just burning within him from an early age.
Yeah, and you can like when I went to Morehouse, you could see that also in just the different type of people that you are around on campus, and some of those mentors stuck out. You talked a little bit about Benjamin Elijah Mays, who was the president of Morehouse when King was there. You talked about Howard Thurman and some of the transformation he learned through him as a religious leader. Can you talk a little bit about just those experiences that shaped his philosophy, these different mentors, like his dad? Like I said, Benjamin Elijah Mays, who wrote the book Born to Rebel. So like all these influential African American males in his life that kind of changed his philosophy. Can you talk a little about that when it comes to social
Yeah, those
justice?
guys are so important. And think about this. Martin Luther King is certainly inspired by his father, but his father is a country preacher. His father's grammar isn't very good. And when he gets in the pulpit, he's shouting and stomping and singing. And Martin Luther King is a little embarrassed by that. It's like, why does my dad sound like he's just off the farm? Well, he was just off the farm. And then he sees people like Benjamin Elijah Mays and Howard Thurman, and he sees these intellectual Black preachers who are delivering very similar messages to his father, but they're doing it while quoting the philosophers. And King says, "Ooh, there's a way to do this that's more sophisticated than my dad." And these become great heroes, and he wants to study those same philosophers. So he's not just interested in becoming a preacher who can rally the people in church. He wants to push people to explore bigger ideas. At first he thinks he wants to be a teacher, maybe a philosopher himself, and only later does he decide he wants to go into the pulpit after all. But it's important how Benjamin Mays and Thurman and so many others at Morehouse are saying to young people like Martin Luther King, if you're here at Morehouse, you are already in the elite. Very few Black men in that generation were getting 4-year degrees, were going to college at all, very much in the minority. So that gives you an opportunity and a responsibility. What are you going to do with that power that you've been given? What are you going to do with this education? You have to think about giving something back. And King gets that drilled into his head every day.
Yeah. Benjamin Elijah Mays in his book talks about like how did the school with so little do so much? Like how did it produce these people like Martin Luther King? And then you have Howard Thurman that talks about putting a crown over your head, you have to grow tall enough to reach it. So it was just interesting to hear how you even, like you said, when you do a biography, you write about all these different people in different ways. And in that, one of the most important characters was the life of Coretta Scott King. Can you talk a bit about how they came together and just her influence? Because she is very much an activist, and even more when you kind of talk about that, even more of an activist when Martin Luther King first met her. So
Yeah, I really wanted to make sure she got the story treatment that she deserved because she still hasn't really received a proper biography, which is, shocking to me. But as you pointed out, she was an activist, and I think that's what King was attracted to the most because he dated a lot of women in Boston. They met in Boston when he was at Boston U and she was at the New England Conservatory, and he was dating two or three women at the same time when he met her, and he immediately made up his mind that this is the one. And it's not because she was prettier or smarter. She was pretty and she was smart. It was really the big difference was that she was an activist. She had been to Antioch College and she'd been involved in all these protests there. And when they met and King started talking about how he wanted to fight Jim Crow, and Coretta wasn't that impressed. She said, how are you going to do it? She wanted details. And she started pushing him like, what's your plan? Have you actually protested anything yet in your life? And he hadn't. She called him on it and she started recommending books for him to read. I think that really excited him. It wasn't, it was the idea that she could be an ally and even a teacher to him.
no, it makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate it that you told her story in a way that it was throughout the life too, because I think sometimes we just kind of make King had to have these people around him. You have Ralph Abernathy, Juanita Abernathy. You have Coretta Scott King. You have all these people that are organizers around him that have radical thought, that have passionate thought. They have this agape love that King talked about. How did that play into the organization and how he talked to people and was able to move people, this agape love?
That's a great question. And, I want to point out that even though King really appreciated his wife's brilliance and her passion and her activism, he was still flawed and he didn't see the potential for women really to be leaders in the movement. And he wanted Coretta to stay home and raise the kids and not get too involved in the movement. So it's another example of where we have to reckon with our heroes' flaws. And King was not a great organizer. He needed people to help him do the groundwork. He was not somebody who knew how to run a big organization. He was a preacher. He was trained to lead a church, but that's about it. And he found himself in this situation where he needed others to provide support. He needed others to do some of these jobs that he wasn't very good at. And he was good at listening. He was good at letting people do their jobs and making the key decisions and then staying out of the way. He was good at staying open to new ideas, so that when younger activists came along and they were leading the lunch counter sit-ins, or they were leading the freedom rides, or later when Stokely Carmichael was organizing the Black Power movement, King didn't get defensive. He continued to engage and to listen to their ideas and to take what he could. So I think that kind of agape love, that kind of recognizing the contributions that everybody could make was a big part of his success.
Yeah, and from writing all these, just in general as a writer, you've written about Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King, Lou Gehrig. Why is it so hard for us to humanize these bit larger than life figures? Like, and through your writing, how have you been able to write that in a way that we can see them? And when I read your book, I really felt like we saw the whole character of Martin Luther King.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't want to blame Hollywood, but we have a tendency to want to simplify our stories into these easily digestible, summaries. And what happens is that we take the easy parts and we cling to those. And we take the stories that are most convenient or most powerful, whether they're true or not. You mentioned Muhammad Ali. The story is that after he won the Olympic gold medal in Rome, he came back and threw his gold medal in the river to protest segregation in Louisville. And that's just not true. He lost the medal, and then later someone made up a story about throwing it in the river. So that's okay. It doesn't diminish Ali's greatness to say that he just lost his gold medal. It doesn't diminish his greatness to say that he had affairs, that he cheated on his wife. These are human beings. And I think that when you acknowledge their flaws then their heroism is even greater, because you can see it in contrast to their flaws. But I think, Hollywood and even some of us, just in our instinct is that we want these simple version of the story. We want to be inspired by Mr. I Have a Dream, and we don't want to think about the parts that complicate that story.
No, I think that's well said, and it goes into the Montgomery bus boycott, because you have someone that's at 26, and I know society always wants to make us, all right, at 26 you got to be doing this, you're doing that. But when King gets there, he's not exactly who we know him to be, but he's thrusted into this role where he becomes, all right, he is the new leader of the civil rights movement. Can you talk a little bit about some of those civil rights movement leaders, the older ones that kind of like, I don't know if I'm sure if King should be the person or what makes him this. Like, he talked a little bit about that and how he was able to prepare himself through the Montgomery bus boycott.
Right. Bus boycott begins end of 1955, and he's 26 years old, and suddenly he can't go back to just being a preacher anymore. The whole city is counting on him, and now the whole world is looking toward him. And he writes to one of his college professors and says, "What am I going to do? They're expecting me to be some kind of a superhero, and I have no clue what comes next." At the same time, all of these other activists, some of them are getting jealous. Like the NAACP is concerned that he's going to suck away support from them. Others are turning into him and saying, "Hey, you got to take this thing to another level. You got to go national with this. We need the Montgomery bus boycott 100 times over in cities all over the country, and you can do it." And he's just sitting there going, "What? What am I supposed to do? How?" And no, there's no blueprint for this. No one's ever done it before. So it's to his credit that he just decides that this is what God has called him to do, and he's going to just throw himself into it, and he's going to learn on the fly. He's going to make mistakes. The next couple of attempts to organize movements don't go very well, and he's being criticized. He's being, already described as like too old and too conservative because he's what, now 31, so to his credit, he just keeps going, keeps trying, and I think what he recognizes is that even if he fails personally and his reputation is damaged, it doesn't matter because he's pushing forward. He's trying to shine a light on racism and on inequality, and if he can get more people to see and more people to join the movement, then good things will happen. But he doesn't have a game plan. He doesn't have a career, 5-year plan for his career. He's just making it up as he goes along.
Yeah, and there's that old adage like to the man with a hammer to the man with a hammer every problem looks like a nail. But it seems like from at least the way you tell the story, at least I'll ask this question is, do you feel like he for each place that he moved, whether it's in Chicago, whether it's in Detroit, all these different places that he brought the movement to, do you feel like he brought the same organizational principles, or did you think that each city required a different mentality, a different type of organization, a different type of focus?
I think each one was different in a way. I mean, he brings the same principles of nonviolence, of sort of seizing the moral high ground and trying to attract tension so that the movement grows. But each city, each movement, each protest was different depending on who was on the ground there and who was doing the grassroots organizing and which leaders in the city were most effective, and how the city responded, how the white governing officials responded to his challenge. So again, it's another example of King being willing to just improvise, just like, I'm going to go there and lend my name, and a lot of media will follow me, a lot of hate will follow me, and we're just going to blow some stuff up and see what happens. And hopefully we blow up enough stuff that eventually we get more allies. People in the North start supporting us more. Maybe a few people in the South, white Southerners, begin supporting us. And most importantly, we get the federal government to get off their butts and to do something in this fight. I think that was ultimately the big prize that he was building toward.
Yeah, what do you think modern movements can kind of learn from the civil rights movement? Because I think the civil rights movement had such a powerful, it had a strong effectiveness of getting laws passed for people to understand how to interact and change. I just wanted to hear, like, in your opinion, from reading all of King's writing this book and learning about King and the civil rights movement, what can modern movements learn from what they were able to accomplish from the civil rights movement?
Well, I think we've seen King's influence filter down to all kinds of modern movements, and we've seen, the push for rights for gay people. We've seen the rights for women. We've seen all kinds of environmental protests that are very much modeled after the civil rights movement of the 1960s, in that they are really trying to protest nonviolently, even when people criticize, like the current wave of protests on college campuses. It's been almost it's been overwhelmingly nonviolent. And that's because King showed that you can get more sympathy and get more attention for your cause by taking the moral high road. And I think the lesson really is that, even though it may feel like society isn't going to change, or that the law isn't going to change, that if you can build enough of a coalition, if you can gain enough sympathy, get others to empathize with your cause, it may be that our behaviors and our attitudes are years ahead of the law, but eventually the law will catch up if the public consensus is strong and if support for these values is strong.
Yeah, I agree. Let's get into some of the surveillance, because I thought that was a very interesting part of the book. Just also King's relationship with the Kennedys, and all that. So how did the Kennedys support and, like, simultaneously their surveillance through the FBI and with J. Edgar Hoover complicate the political dynamics of that era?
Yeah, that's a complicated one. But if you think about it, Kennedy's and Lyndon Johnson were really important in advancing the cause of civil rights. We get the Civil Rights Act, we get the Voting Rights Act, two of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. This comes about because of the alliance between the Kennedys and King and Johnson and King. And at the same time, the Kennedys and Johnson are stabbing him in the back. So it's the greatest relationship between a president and an activist, maybe ever, maybe since Frederick Douglass and Lincoln. But at the same time, it has this really dark underbelly, because Robert F. Kennedy authorizes wiretaps on King for the FBI to begin surveilling him and his associates. LBJ reauthorizes it and condones it, and even encourages the FBI to leak King's sexual activities to the media. So it's one of the darkest moments in American law enforcement history. We are surveilling a private citizen. We are not just surveilling him, but attempting to undermine his work, attempting to destroy him, really. At one point, they send the FBI sends tapes of King's activities in hotel rooms with a note saying, you're going to be exposed. Your wife's going to know about this. The world is going to know about it. The only way out for you is suicide. That's the work of our government. And King goes on. He has to push through this. And the FBI even groomed a successor, someone they wanted to plant as the new leader of the civil rights movement. So it's just vicious. And I was not prepared for just how vicious it was. I really thought I knew the scope of it, but it was darker than I ever possibly imagined. And the fact that King endured that and kept going, unbelievable.
Yeah, when I was reading it, I thought that it kind of changed that whole perspective to me. Because when you grow up reading books, you kind of see the Kennedys and that movement as like this constant progression. Like, okay, they got this bill passed in '64, voters' rights, then they got the immigration. It's like it kind of felt like it was all in this order, but you really see this constant tug of war. You see this FBI, like you said, FBI spying, and even like you said, this backstabbing that it changes the perspective, but you also know that they had, like, as far as the movement had to go through these progressions in order to get through it. So can you talk a little bit about, like, the psychology and the turmoil, the struggle, I guess, that Martin Luther King had to deal with from all of these different actors, on one hand shaking his hand, on the other side coming for his life.
Yeah, think about the fact that, first of all, he's arrested 29 times. He's stabbed in the chest. His home is bombed. All of those things would have made most mortals quit. And then add to that his own government is surveilling him, that presidents are inviting him to the White House, and when he leaves, calling the FBI to get the latest scoop on his extramarital affairs. It's brutal, and it does take a toll. And I think sometimes King didn't even fully appreciate how bad a toll it was taking. For example, he starts speaking out on the Vietnam War, and newspapers begin criticizing him for it. Like he's not qualified to speak on international affairs. And he's really sad. Like, why are they treating me this badly? And he probably doesn't fully appreciate that people at all of these newspapers have been reading the surveillance transcripts, that they know about his extramarital affairs. So they're prejudiced against him. They're biased. They are believing some of what the FBI is saying, that this man is a moral fraud. And that's affecting his media coverage, and that's affecting his popularity around the country. So by 1966, 2/3 of all Americans disapprove of Martin Luther King in a Gallup survey. When he's assassinated, something like 31% of Americans said they thought he had it coming. And King is just going on. Like he's sad. He's really sad. I think the last couple of years of his life, he's so depressed. Some of his friends are worried that he might be suicidal. And you just feel for him, and you know that our government is making it worse, that they're piling it on, they're trying to break him.
Yeah, from your research, did you feel like there was any evidence of it being fabricated in the sense of like, all right, we J. Edgar Hoover has said, all right, he's the most dangerous, what I think they said, Negro in the world or in the United States. Do you think there's like that feel like, oh, we got to get anything we can on him, or is it just this is what was going on and he's kind of giving us this layup that we just see his whole life from? I'm kind of curious on how much of that part did you have to cipher as a writer?
My strong feeling is that they weren't making up the fact that he had extramarital affairs. The details are voluminous, and in fact, I've interviewed people who knew about the affairs, and they confirmed that. So I don't think King was monogamous. I don't think he was faithful to Coretta, sadly. But that doesn't mean that the FBI had any right in using that fact to try to destroy him. And I think that we don't know just how much they're lying about him. We don't know what kind of rumors they're spreading to members of Congress or to members of the media. But we do know that everybody's got weaknesses, and King has had his own. And what's important about that isn't the fact that he was flawed. What's important is the fact that the FBI weaponized those flaws.
Yeah, and do you think with the 20, because I know more are coming out in 2027, some of the tapes, do you feel like that will have a significant alter of the understanding of King's life, or is there anything that, I guess, even as a writer, would you be compelled to write more from the book based on anything, a follow-up or anything based on the tapes from 2027?
I think it'll depend on what's on the tapes. I think, my hunch is that most of the stuff is out there already. And the only question is whether hearing the tapes and hearing King's voice is going to have an emotional fallout, whether it'll make people, well, it'll be hard for people to hear that. If there's something newsworthy on the tapes, then absolutely I would, update that in the book for the next edition.
Yeah, I can only imagine just like all the Twitter drops and quick messages. I think people are gonna.
Yeah, that I don't want to see that, but
Yeah,
they
that's what I'm
no
saying.
choice.
So I kind of want to get towards the Selma march because I thought that was a very critical part as well. Like, how did his approach change, kind of from as you saw from Montgomery all the way to Selma, and just that moment of saying, "All right, we're gonna turn back." I think that's such a moment of like I don't know if it's pragmatic moment or is it just his most conflicted moment. What did you see in his life that got him to that point?
That's a tough one. King was always a believer in the power of the federal government. He felt like it was worth it to be practical. It was worth it to work through official channels, worth it to compromise, because only the government had the power to really make systematic change, to relieve some of the suffering, to fight poverty, to end Jim Crow laws. So he was willing to deal with the white power structure and try to make change happen. And then when he gets to Selma, he's really heavily criticized for turning around on the Edmund Pettus Bridge because people had traveled from all over the country to join this march. They were prepared to go across that bridge and to violate the court order, and the federal government was begging King not to, you know, and ultimately he he compromised, and I think he lost the confidence of a lot of younger activists who felt like he was being too compliant, and that he was too much cooperating too easily with the federal government. But of course, it's easy to judge him in hindsight, but he obviously, persevered and led another march, and that march to Selma was hugely, from Selma to Montgomery, was hugely important. But I think that was one of the marks that really hurt King in the eyes of a lot of people.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting reading the story. Kind of, I want to say, I don't want, for lack of a better term, like the movement passing King by. You saw that a lot. You saw when he was talking to Stokely Carmichael and his slow to talk on the Vietnam War. You see King in through this book as someone that's questioning himself a lot. Like, has the movement passed me? Has this gone through? But how, I guess, from your research, how did that continue to mobilize him? Because you see him go and still do these amazing speeches, even in spite of that feeling of has the movement how has the movement passed me by?
I think, and remember, he's still only in his middle 30s. He's still really young, but he seems to have accepted the idea that it wasn't about him, and that if he was going to take a beating in the press, if he was going to take criticism from Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael for being, an Uncle Tom, that he would just have to endure that, because he knew who he was, and he knew that he was fighting for something really radical, and that it was rooted in his Christian faith, and there was no shaking him from that. So as some of these other activists are pushing for more violent, more aggressive tactics, King is becoming more radical, but he's sticking to nonviolence. He's becoming more radical in that he's expanding his scope to talk about things like income inequality, to talk about the war in Vietnam. He's saying that he's going to talk about Northern racism now, and he's going to move to Chicago until the city of Chicago makes fundamental changes in housing laws and school segregation. So he's becoming more radical in his own way. And I think, even Malcolm X recognized that and began to have more appreciation for King in his
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, even if you read like where do we go from here? And he talks about chaos or community. You see King throughout his time having radical beliefs and pushing for it. It was just backed by, as you said, this focus on nonviolence through love, through spirituality. But it didn't seem like that always during the later movements were able for people to see it as much. I think that was interesting to see throughout your book as well.
I think they saw it, they just didn't like it.
Yeah, exactly.
And as a result, they just kind of dismissed it as being, crazy communist stuff.
Yeah. And to that, I also want to talk a little bit about his world travels because I think he went to India and he went to Ghana and he started to see blackness across the diaspora. How did those global travels help him understand his own freedoms within America?
It was a really exciting time, and I think that the Pan-African movement and the decolonization in Africa was really inspiring a lot of people in America, and the other direction too. People in Africa were excited to see King and others standing up to American racism and segregation. So it was a really exciting moment. It was a feeling that, like, the world is changing. We may be on the brink of something big here, and I think King's travels only helped him better understand that, going to Ghana, especially, and seeing Kwame Nkrumah, and seeing and traveling and meeting W.E. Du Bois there at the inauguration of Nkrumah. All of that was really eye-opening. Again, this is a young guy who's, had never been out of the country, or had very seldom been out of the country up until that point. So he's beginning to see the place of people of color in the world, and he's beginning to see his own potential influence in a new way.
I feel like even though it's the most talked about speech in King's life, can you talk a little bit about the "I Have a Dream" speech? I know that in the book you lay out how that wasn't even the main focus of the speech. That he had given that speech multiple times. There's always been that saying that Mahalia Jackson was telling him, say the dream, talk about the dream. He just talk about that moment, how it galvanized people, and through writing that, like how were you? What was your positioning on writing that moment and really giving it the space that people have always in its impact in American history?
Well, first of all, you're right that it was the "I Have a Dream" speech was improvised. I don't think it was Mahalia who encouraged it. I think Mahalia was just saying after he started, "That's right, tell him about the dream." And then some people made the leap to say that she encouraged him to launch into the "I Have a Dream" speech. I don't think so. The first half of the speech that he gave was written out, and it was most largely about economics, and it was very radical in a way. He talked about police brutality. He talked about economic inequality. He hinted at the idea of reparations. So it was a pretty radical speech. And then when he got to the end of the printed remarks, he launched into the "I Have a Dream," and of course that was so powerful. And most Americans had never heard him preach that way before. Most white Americans had never heard a black preacher. Period. So it really moved people and really stirred them. And "I Have a Dream," of course, became the only thing people remembered. To answer the second part of your question, for me as a writer, how do you tell that story? How do you describe the greatest speech of the 20th century? How do you capture the magic of that voice, right? You can't, because no matter how I write it, you're not going to hear that beautiful voice, and you're not going to feel that rhythm. You're not going to. So I decided to try to tell it sort of as a panorama. I told it through the story of three people: King, the white park ranger standing by his side, and this 20-year-old girl named Francine Yeager, who was in the crowd, who traveled from Chicago at the last minute with just a change of underwear and two bottles of Pepsi in her backpack, so that you could see how that speech is affecting and changing people's lives in that moment.
Yeah. And then from your doing your interviews, like how was that? Like getting all these people to get into the book. I know you talked about me talking with Dick Gregory, and he was one of the catalysts for the book, but and Harry Belafonte. Just talk a little bit about that experience, like getting all these different people to come along and getting there and getting to talk to them for this book.
Yeah, that was one of the great privileges of my life, to get to know people who knew Martin Luther King, and even for a couple of them to become my friends. To think that like a friend of Martin Luther King's could be a friend of mine is just, gives me goosebumps. Um, and I knew right away that this was something super special, that all these folks were in their 80s or 90s, and this might be the last chance to interview them for a book. And I really approached nervously, like, did they want me to do this book? Did they think that another King biography was important? Would they help me with it? Because, if I didn't have support of the people who knew King and the scholars in the field, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to do it. And the fact that they all felt like, not all, but like the vast majority said to me, we really need a new biography of Martin, or ML, as some of them called him, if they went way back, because they felt like that we as a society had lost sight of his humanity and turned him into this, mythological figure, and they wanted to see the real man back, at least on the pages of a book. So it was a great thrill for me. I interviewed, more than 100 people who knew King, and I did most of them in person before COVID hit. So it was just one of the great thrills of my life.
I love to hear it. And how was I know it had to feel like a lot of pressure to write this book, speaking of like talking about the towering figure that is Martin Luther King. So talk to us about that. Like how did you feel a lot of pressure writing this book
Oh
or
my
how
God.
did you navigate that?
Insane amounts of pressure. I mean, I feel pressure on any book I write. Like, Lou Gehrig, who am I to tell Lou Gehrig's story? I never met him. His family didn't give me permission. Like, millions of fans look up to him. People with ALS look up to him. That's an enormous responsibility to take someone's life story in your hands. But with Martin Luther King, it's like multiple levels of more responsibility, because he's a saint to many people. I mean, people have his picture on the wall next to Jesus, in a lot of homes, right? So that's a lot of responsibility, and I was really nervous about whether I could do him justice, whether people would be receptive to hearing about some of his flaws, or whether there might be, a backlash for that. But I gained confidence, first of all, by, like I said earlier, asking for help from his friends and from other scholars in the field. And then from just digging and digging and finding new material and realizing that like I could contribute something to our understanding of King. I found, his father's unpublished memoirs. I found tapes that Coretta made um, when right after her husband died. I found files that King's secretary had kept, so that I could add to our understanding of him, and that just felt like a great privilege.
And then as far as I guess, what was the biggest, most fun thing, or I guess for lack of better, your perception or the thing when you're writing this book, you're like, wow, I'm so glad I got to do this. I know you talked about the interviews, but was there anything that outside the interviews or just writing the story that you're like, I'm glad to bring this to light about Dr. Martin Luther King?
Well, we talked a lot about some of the big important things like the FBI's treatment of him, but to me, sometimes just bringing out the little things that humanize him were really important to me. That his barber, I interviewed for the book, Nelson Malden, told me about, how he tipped or didn't tip. His friend June Dobbs Butts told me, about how when they'd come home from school as kids, they would have white bread with butter and sugar on top, and that Martin's brother cheated at Monopoly, but Martin would never cheat. Just finding these little details that remind us that he's human, that he chewed his fingernails. One of the things I loved about King is that he would reach out his hand and like touch you on the shoulder or on the arm when he talked to you, and he would start a lot of sentences with yes, you'd be talking, he said yes. He was just always I get the impression he was a really good listener and a loving person. So getting that firsthand from people who knew him, I felt like that was really special.
Yeah, I think your book is so important because even I saw something the other day where people were doing AI photos of King and like they've just used his imagery for so many things that have nothing to do with his legacy and what has pushed him. So just this book and being another great resource to read if you want to get a full picture of King. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you for writing this book. And I just want to end this conversation with, he had a question and I wanted to go back to it. Like, where do we go from here? He always says community or chaos. If going towards community, like how do we build community in 2025 through King's legacy and everything that from your book?
Oh, that's all you need out of me? Just a real easy question you're going to end on. Um, where do we go from here? Chaos or community feels really relevant today because it feels like chaos is winning. It really does, and I feel like, especially with the advent of our cell phones and social media and the internet, like it's really easy just to stay in our little box and not really embrace community but when you do that, it feels even more chaotic outside your little box. So I think the lesson from King that can really help us is that we need to listen to each other and love each other and think of even the people we disagree with as our brothers and sisters, and talk to them and hear what they have to say, and just try to care for one another, because we really need it right now.
That's well said. Actually, I have one question because we always end this podcast this way. What should be in a writer's toolkit?
um, Coffee and empathy. How about that?
Sounds good. All right. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's truly been a pleasure. I will link your book in the bio for more people to find it. It is an incredible book, King of Life. Thank you so much for your time, and I truly appreciate you for writing this book.
Thank you. Good talking to you.